Okay, looks like we have the benefit of everyone being in the room. Check, check, testing, testing. All right. So looks like we might be able to make a 1 minute early start because everyone's in the room now. Why not? It gives us more time for questions or more time for an early literal 1 minute. So I'm Dr. Sarven McLinton. I'll be chairing your session on media and games. We have a really interesting lineup today. Everything from podcasting through to esports and digital media and what was the other one? I'll find out in a second. Streaming, live streaming as well. So really eclectic group, but the consistent theme here is around media. So I'd like to invite our first presenter to the stage. We have Mark Johnson, and this one is a digital presentation. So we'll also hopefully they're on chat as well. And if anyone from any of these presentations does not want your content shared on social media, please call out, pop it in the chat, or come up and see me sometime during the presentations. All right, so take it away, Mark. All right, Mark's okay with presentation being shared on social media.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk. I'm very sorry I'm not there in person, but today, and with the essential assistance of my Japanese-speaking research assistant, James, I'll be presenting the findings from our recent project looking at Japanese game live streamers. So given the nature of this conference, I'm sure we all know what Twitch is, but just to recap and make sure we're all on the same page, in most countries, game live streaming is dominated by Twitch, and Twitch really stands in the foreground of scholarship on this field, although there's also a growing body of work on Chinese live streaming platforms as well. Scholarship on Twitch and on live streaming more broadly, however, tends to either explicitly or implicitly assume an English-speaking, and in general white and most often North American, subject. There are some really great exceptions, such as research focused on including the experiences of black streamers, Spanish language streamers, and Brazilian Twitch streamers. Yet nationality, language, local culture, these sorts of things, and their impacts on live streaming have in general yet to be studied in much detail. There's therefore a clear gap in research here. What sorts of game live streaming practices and communities are being forged outside of the English-speaking world? One place we chose to examine this is in the context of Japan. Japan is of course a hugely influential nation in culture and global game production and game culture more broadly, but their game live streamers and game live stream viewers have yet to be studied in any kind of detail, either by English or indeed by Japanese researchers. A Japanese language search was done as part of this project, and whilst a few papers were found which were focused on Japanese live streaming on sites including Nico Nico, and gaming was sometimes mentioned in these papers, it's never really the focus. Japanese game live streamers like those from many other countries and cultures have grown rapidly in number in the last decade, but haven't yet been examined. So into this setting, we present what we think is the first study in either English or in Japanese, focused on Japanese game streamers. To explore this area, this paper primarily draws on 15 semi-structured interviews with Japanese game live streamers. In identifying candidates, we looked for broadcasters who were active, streamed mostly or exclusively games content, and had high numbers of regular viewers. Interviews used a set of predetermined questions which allowed for open-ended answers, with additional follow-up questions asked to clarify notable or significant responses. From this interview data, we found two key findings. The first of these involves the dynamics of anonymity and visibility in game streaming. Many researchers, myself included, have noted that it's the norm for game streamers to show their faces on stream, with webcams being used in most channels and seen as a very default and common aspect of live streams. However, this proved not to be true for Japanese game streamers. Only 3 of our 15 respondents reported that they did indeed show their faces during their streams. In an equivalent sample of English language streamers, we'd expect 14 or indeed all 15 to report that they do show their faces, whereas here merely 3 did so. This is a marked and striking difference which merits some attention. Instead, a common alternative amongst these Japanese streamers to showing their physical faces was to instead present themselves as VTubers. A VTuber is a digitally generated humanoid figure, in general humanoid, which mirrors the real-world actions of the streamer or broadcaster through voice and motion capture, but without showing their real-world self. Existing research on VTubers notes that much of the appeal of the VTuber lies in the ability to roleplay as a fictional character, especially female fictional characters. One of our respondents, for example, told us that they felt, quote, "If there's a cute girl there on screen, it's more likely people will like me and be motivated to come along and watch my streams," unquote. VTubers are in fact so common amongst Japanese game streamers that another one of our respondents identified, quote, "streamers who show their faces," unquote, and VTubers as being two distinct genres of streamers in Japan, while another respondent argued that VTubers, quote, are a tool that's tailor-made and well-suited to Japan, unquote. However, it is specifically in the ability of the VTuber to obscure the broadcaster's true appearance that we begin to see what makes the VTuber not just viable for game streamers in general, but especially useful and of interest for those from Japan. This is because, in terms of online habits more broadly, privacy has been noted by many researchers as being incredibly important to Japanese web users. The fact that most of the most successful mobile and social network games in Japan use anonymous user registration is in part so the players can play these games without their real-world peers knowing their gaming habits. More generally, on Japanese virtual spaces, acts of open or deliberate self-identification are habitually avoided. This is shown by how, for example, we see that Kaudashi, which means face exposing, is a specific content group on Nico Nico, whereas it's not on Twitch, because on Twitch the assumption is that people will be showing their faces. When not in this group, though, Japanese users do a range of things, such as employing what we might think of as camouflage, so things like masks or camera setups, which keep the head out of frame, as well as trying to further remediate real-world features or aspects of themselves, such as using text-to-speech, or presenting themselves as a VTuber character, and all of these are in an effort to keep their digital lives and their physical lives as separate as possible. Within this context, then, our data showed that the specific privacy concerns from Japanese game streamers and the reasons so many of them use VTubers seem to break down into two main aspects. Not wanting to be recognized by peers, friends, colleagues, and so on, but also concerns over security of personal data. In the first case, for example, one respondent said, quote, I think a lot of people don't want to be recognized on the street or get outed to their friends. Another said many Japanese game streamers are, quote, scared of being found out by people who know them, unquote, while two others also both articulated the idea that Japan is, culturally speaking, a small, in air quotes, which is semi, which is a term which also means narrow or crowded, country. These streamers therefore all express this feeling that in spite of Japan's population being 125 million, they would be, or at least could be, very easy to ID and to pin down. And this is something very undesirable and something to be avoided at all costs. In the second case, though, we had, for instance, one respondent who asserted that they were, quote, worried about my personal data, unquote, which another echoed by saying, quote, people are scared that showing their face might mean they become identified, unquote. While a third said they often, quote, thinking about the risk of things like having my personal data identified, unquote. Such aversion to being identified in Japanese virtual spaces reflects also a degree of mainstream public stigma towards game live streaming comparable to stigma towards gaming in general. Another respondent said that because streaming, quote, is not a very well-known culture, unquote, yet, quote, there's still prejudice against it, unquote, and therefore one would need to hide this part of one's identity. To become publicly known as a streamer, it seems, is seen as having uncertain or unpredictable ramifications for one's personal life, and is seen also, not unreasonably, as being an irrevocable choice, yet one most streamers never give a second thought to outside of this Japanese context. Moving on now from privacy and VTubers, and gosh, it is hard to do all this in 12 minutes, the second of our two key findings relates to the international character of the Japanese game streamers we interviewed and observed. As noted prior in this paper, studies of game live streaming in general assume a North American or European and English-speaking or European language-speaking and in general white subject, but there is another reason specific to the Japanese context as well which makes this finding intriguing. External perceptions of Japan, its culture and its people have historically been entwined with narratives accentuating its otherness. Critical analysis of this otherness's construction originates with Edward Said's Orientalism back in 1978, in which he posits a process in which Western social discourses, at times consciously, at times unconsciously, essentialize Eastern cultures down to a limited set of traits observed and ascribed by Westerners. This remains present into the modern day, yet at the same time, the perceived special qualities of Japan and its cultural output are also key to the phenomenon of Japanophilia, in which they elicit interest and adoration from consumers abroad. The massive global interest in Japanese pop cultural products, particularly those related to things like manga and anime and Japanese created games, is a great example. Overseas perceptions of Japan simultaneously thus perceive it as exotic and other, but also special and quite enticing, a partial unknown which invites further exploration by those outside of it. Well, in this wider context then, our first set of findings does appear to support the, from the Western point of view, otherness of the Japanese game streamer. Not using webcams is extremely unusual in the wider game streaming context, and the perspectives outlined as explanations are very distinctive and culturally bound. However, our second set of findings regarding language and geography show instead strong commonalities and relationships with the rest of the game streaming world. In considering this international dimension, we do first note then that Japanese game streamers unsurprisingly reported that most of their viewers were indeed from Japan. Yet while this was the standard position reported, others had different demographics to state, including many viewers from the US, Korea, and Taiwan. Other levels of international connection also came through in our study. These broke down into two groups: the languages that viewers were using to talk to streamers, and the languages Japanese streamers were using to reach out to viewers. In the first case, for example, many respondents asserted getting comments in other languages, primarily English. And in turn, what we discovered was that these sorts of comments seem to reinforce these streamers' claims that some of their audiences can be international in nature, which demonstrates that in spite of a language gap, or perhaps because of it, and an eagerness to engage with Japanese gamers, these streamers are in fact being watched by a global audience. Indeed, people sometimes watch VTubers to learn another language, making the preponderance of VTubers amongst Japanese game streamers even more noteworthy. We also noted a multilingual aspect to these Japanese game streamers, with many expressing some basic competence with English. In this context, it's interesting to note that the majority of our respondents did not use domestic Japanese live streaming platform Nico Nico, but used Twitch instead, even though that platform is mostly associated with English. We can understand these dimensions by looking at both Japan's relations with other nations and the spread and uptake of Japanese pop culture. For example, Japanese is one of the most popular foreign language choices in Taiwan, behind English, and the two states have positive relations, without much of the post-war historical baggage in relations with mainland China and South Korea. In terms of English, meanwhile, most young Japanese people do know at least basic English, and demographics of live streaming sites, both viewers and streamers, skew towards those in their teens, 20s, and 30s. Some Japanese game live streamers do have a Japanese-only chat rule in their chat, but whereas English-only, or Spanish or German or whatever, rules are almost universal for streamers broadcasting in European languages, we observe such rules being far less common in Japanese language broadcasts. Japanese streamers may be more so than English language speakers or those broadcasting in other European tongues, thus seem quite open to the unexpected prospects of connections with overseas viewers and feel far less need to police these. And there we go. It really is hard to say much in 12 minutes, and we've run out of time. If you'd like to read more, please do check out my recent book, Twitch, which is by far the most up-to-date summation of the platform out there, and indeed does include some discussion of this Japanese project. If you'd like to read the preprint of the journal version of this paper, though, which is currently trapped in review hell, please just shoot me an email. Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and hope you all have a great day.
We'll leave the slide up for a second. Just in case you want to copy down the email, we'll leave that up there for 5 seconds or so before we take it down. Whilst you're doing that, I will admit that I did have a great temptation to make my first syllable or word really loud. So I resisted the urge, but it was a really wonderful presentation. So thank you very much for that, Mark. And let's pass on to our second presentation by Ryan Stanton on parasocial players.
I notes on my one as well, so yeah. Well, this one's already on. This one, yeah. Easy. All right. Hi everyone. I'm Ryan Stanton. A lot of you already know me, but if you don't, I'm a PhD candidate at UCID, studying gaming podcasts. In previous years, I've talked a lot about the sort of business and the creator side of these things, and this year I'm shifting gears and talking about authenticity and how the audience sort of thinks about this and responds to this in relation to these podcasts and the creators. Of course, to do this, I need to define authenticity. And I have a definition here that comes from Brinson and Lemon, who are speaking about it in relation to podcasts. And they say that authenticity is a media user's ability to make judgments about the media figure. Basically, authenticity is a measure of how the audience perceives a creator. or to put it even more simply, it's about vibes, right? To be authentic is to have good vibes, to be taken as sort of trustworthy, real, and honest in the assessment of the audience or the specific audience member. In contrast, to be inauthentic is to sort of have hidden intentions, to be a sellout, a liar, a grifter, all that sort of stuff. With this in mind, there is research that is relevant to this for both podcasts and other forms of gaming media. Podcasting is often thought of as being particularly authentic, or sort of another related word as being particularly intimate, right? The idea that you're hearing another person talking directly in your ear is highlighted by McHugh as setting the medium apart and making it particularly effective in this regard. Others, meanwhile, have looked at how advertisers acknowledge how the medium is authentic, and they want to leverage that in the ways that they advertise to be more successful. This is why you will often hear on podcasts and in other mediums sort of host-read advertisements rather than the traditional sort of radio advertisements, because they're wanting to leverage the authenticity that creators have in the eyes of the audience, right? And you do see that on Twitch as well to a certain extent. And you see authenticity in other aspects of Twitch, according to some of the other research here. Coward and Daniel, for example, talk about how Twitch, the affordances of the platform, are uniquely designed to foster what they call 1.5-sided relationships, 1.5-sided parasocial relationships, right? The platform is designed to create interactions that create a relationship which fosters authenticity. Similarly, Leith discusses how streaming creates parasocial bonds, and Ruberg looks at how the location of streamers within their bedroom sort of works to create this sense of intimacy, of the creator inviting you into their personal space in order to foster that sense of authenticity, right? So what I have here is it's important to state that authenticity is also kind of a lie here, right? That's why I sort of had it in quotation marks at the start. The audience may assess how real they feel the creators are, but even at the most real, there is still an element of performance. This might just be in terms of, when you're playing a scary game, exaggerating how scared you are for the sake of like making it more fun, or it might be, I'm in a committed relationship with a partner, but I never talk about that on stream because I don't want that part of myself to be reflected in that online persona. So there's a selective nature in regards to how people perform that kind of complicates this idea of authenticity, which we should keep in mind. And as I've highlighted, there's already a lot of research on this stuff, particularly looking at the creators. What I've found is there's less looking at how the audiences view it. And so as part of my research into gaming podcasts, I wanted to look at this and see whether the audiences sort of view podcasts as being different in regards to authenticity. Put more simply, does the medium affect the message? And so to do this, I got a lot of data. I've got statistics here. The sort of key things to note are I surveyed podcast audiences, and I got about 1,200 respondents giving written responses to questions relating to this. 44% of them said podcasts were their sort of primary gaming media, and 46% said that podcasts were just one, and they also listened or watched other forms of gaming media. And the results I'm about to present are sort of equalized across both of them. It's not like the people that are positive on podcasts are all from that 44%. It's an even spread from both of those groups. So the first finding I have here is that audience members sort of thought that podcasts were more authentic, or at least some of them. One of the questions I asked was, what sets gaming podcasts apart from other forms of gaming media? And this was the sort of fourth biggest response. Fourth doesn't sound like much, but 2, 3, and 4 were all within like 50 respondents of each other, and one was just, well, you don't have to look at it, which kind of obvious. A notable portion of respondents stated that these podcasts are more intimate, authentic, or personal than other forms of gaming media. And what was particularly interesting was anytime they compared them to other mediums, it was to sort of highlight the strengths of podcasting or point out the weaknesses of the other mediums, you know? And as I said, this was true for those who just listened to podcasts and listened to multiple mediums. I've got a quote here that sort of represents this, and I think it highlights sort of how podcasts hit what I sort of call the Goldilocks zone, right? They balanced the fun, the information, and the authenticity that listeners wanted to get out of it, right? And it also serves as a good transition to the next point. See, part of why these podcasts are easier to listen to is that the audience felt like they had a relationship with these hosts. In response to a question asking what they felt their perceived personal relationship with hosts was, many acknowledged that the hosts felt like friends, and in doing so, validated the feelings of authenticity that were projected here. They talked about how much they knew about the hosts personally, how the hosts had interacted with them either within the podcast or on social media or in Discord sort of thing, you know, and how much they knew them. All of this sort of provided a lot of textbook markers of parasocial relationships, and some of them sort of even explicitly mentioned that, which was, so it was about 600 responses said that they had a personal relationship here. And then there was also about 600 responses that said the relationship wasn't real, that acknowledged it was parasocial and that it didn't actually exist. And this was particularly interesting because I explicitly didn't mention parasocial relationships in my responses, but respondents themselves brought up that term, indicating that they sort of had at least some conception or understanding of it, and that was how they viewed it. What was particularly interesting was that those 600 that said it was real and those 600 that said it wasn't, weren't mutually exclusive. Some responses said, you know, both things together. I know it's not real, but it feels like it. I feel like they're my friends and they know them, you know. I've got a great quote here which sums up this sentiment that I thought, you know, that I saw a lot throughout this discussion, and I just sort of want to briefly read it, you know. I don't think ascribing semi-friendship to internet personalities is particularly useful. I do think it's normal to care about them as human beings and be impacted by their lives. I certainly cried when Giant Bomb co-founder Ryan Davis died, and the humor of Jeff Gersman and Ryan was very formative to me. But I think it's better to see these as things I can personally take as my own thing and understand it is separate from the actual people who are just living their own life, and my only window into that life is their work and what they feel comfortable sharing publicly. So, what does all this mean, right? What can we take from this? First up, potentially kind of obvious, audiences do have different perspectives on different forms of gaming media. And, you know, kind of obvious, but something that merits further research. Second, audiences understand parasocial relationships, or at least have some conception of it, even if it might be different to the academic conception. This isn't something that I think has really been touched on in prior research. It often sort of talks about the audiences in a way that sort of assumes that they might not know what it is, it feels like. And more importantly, audiences acknowledging parasocial relationships didn't diminish the impact of the bond they felt, at least for some of them. More empirical research in this field to determine how widespread this sentiment is will be great, and something that, you know, I can hopefully do once I've got the PhD conferred and got a job and all that, you know. But for now, that's kind of basically what I've had. I'm not sure where I am on time, but yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now, or there's my socials and email, and yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that presentation, Ryan. Now, we'll invite our last speaker, and then it'll be open up to question time. And our last speaker, Haryo, will be going over Indonesian mobile esports as a confluence of game studies and mobile media studies. Exciting.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Haryo. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at the RMIT University under the supervision of Professor Ingrid Richardson, Distinguished Professor Larry Hurt, and Dr. Hugh Davis, who is here with us. Thank you very much for attending my last and hopefully not least talk on the confluence of mobile media studies and game studies in the Indonesian mobile esports. Before we begin, I would like to state my acknowledgement of country. I, Haryo Pambuko Jiwandono, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work, learn, and live today, the Kaurna people. I pay respect to elders past, present, and future, and I acknowledge the importance of indigenous knowledge in academia. So what exactly is mobile esports? Fundamentally, it is mobile game competitions on smartphones. A closer look, however, revealed that mobile esports has combined competitive gaming with mobile media affordances, which allow esports to be mixed with a wide array of popular mobile media practice. The practice of mobile esports goes even further in Indonesia, where it has been institutionalized through the formation and appointment of esports organizations, especially at education institutions such as schools and universities. The institutionalization of mobile esports in Indonesia coexists with its precarious work, which are often facilitated by social media. Oops, sorry. Yeah, technology. Sorry.
Your questions, everyone.
Okay. Yes, we're back online. Sorry about that. So the Indonesian mobile esports is the focus of my PhD research project. I have been researching the phenomenon since 2018 when it started to become mainstream in Indonesia, well before I began my PhD. And the candidature over the past 2.5 years have been providing me with necessary supports to further my research. In the first year, I emphasized the transformative capabilities of mobile media towards esports. In the second year, I argue about how Indonesian mobile esports translate into precarious work and institutionalization. As I'm moving toward the end of my PhD, I plan to frame Indonesian mobile esports from the perspective of both mobile media studies and game studies by borrowing relevant concepts. Specific to DiGRA Australia 2025 is my research potential contribution to the Australian game studies community. I use digital ethnography as my method. I do so because digital ethnography has proven to be effective in understanding new digital media phenomena. Some examples, including mobile media uses in Asia, digital gaming in domestic setting in the UK, and esports community in the United States. I've completed my data collection and I'm refining my data analysis at this point. To understand the confluence of mobile media studies and game studies in the Indonesian mobile esports, I borrow relevant concepts from both research areas to see how they intersect and on which aspects. Those concepts are mobile media affordances and media convergence for mobile media studies. Reflecting on my research findings, the Indonesian mobile esports took off because of its affordability. It becoming mainstream in the process, which gradually develops characteristics on its own, such as esports precarious work and institutionalization. My research is also guided by a concept of games, culture, and society in looking at how mobile esport has become a signature gaming practice in Indonesia. The gamification, which integrates esports into media practice and national programs in Indonesia, and the competitions, media practices and esports in institutions in Indonesia. This mobile media and game studies concept do intersect in Indonesia on two aspects. First, mobile media have vital roles in not only shaping Indonesian gaming culture through mobile esports, but also open the door for Indonesians to participate in at least regional Southeast Asian gaming culture. Secondly, mobile media has become the specificity of digital gaming in Indonesia, on which esports practices, especially on social media, and government policies, which include the institutionalization and even national game developments. My data analysis shows that the confluence of mobile media studies and game studies in Indonesian esports primarily occurs on social media and education institutions. To support my data analysis, I experimented with systematic literature review by generating bibliometric networks using VOS viewer software. To see the direction of game studies, mobile media studies, and esports research area using database from Scopus to social science, arts, and humanities, such terms as my research discipline. I'm very new to both systematic literature review and using the software, and this is just an experiment, so inputs and comments are welcome with open arms. In reading the networks, I found those research areas are connected to media and education networks on multiple locations. Now, combining my ongoing research with the network maps, mobile media studies and game studies meet the Indonesian mobile esports on social media and education institutions. It means the confluence can be understood as the primacy of mobile media in the Indonesian digital gaming practices and policies. Henceforth, studying digital games in Indonesia requires attention to Indonesian mobile media culture, whereas studying mobile media in Indonesia will be more fruitful if we move away from the perception of mobile media culture as a growing phenomenon in Indonesia and see how it has matured through mobile gaming. The importance of social media in the Indonesian mobile esports is reflected on its three prominent precarious work: digital entrepreneurship, local esports, and traditional entrepreneurship, all of which are facilitated by, amplified by, and facilitating social media practices. In the areas of education institution, there is a strong growth of mobile esports in the Indonesian schools and universities, which esports societies can be found in both institutions. Those societies also often receive support from Chinese mobile game publishers as the IP owners of popular mobile games in Indonesia, in the forms of community building and financial rewards. Esports is now incorporated as an extracurricular activity in the Indonesian education institutions. As such, it requires communication among educators, parents, and students to approve students' involvements and to appoint educators as the extracurricular director, thus bridging generational gaps in Indonesia. The main benefit of esports as an extracurricular activity is the recognition of students' achievements on esports towards the schools and students themselves, while they will be counted as credits. Extracurricular esports is overseen and regulated by the Indonesian government through collaboration with Chinese game publishers, which license their games use in education institution setting. Esports organizations such as the Indonesian Esports Executive Board and the Garudaku Esports Academy organize regular year-long esports competition to keep students occupied and to provide non-academic scholarships for esports achiever. With all this said, what does this phenomenon mean for Australia? The growth of Indonesian mobile esports opened an opportunity to include mobile esports in the Australian digital games community of practice. Australia and Indonesia are close neighbors, and the thought of Australian participation in Southeast Asian esports is not far-fetched, as Australian soccer has been a member of the Southeast Asian Football Federation on the AFF since 2013. In esports, Australia participated at the Bali 2022 IESF, although not on mobile esports. These backdrops show the foundation of esports collaboration between Australia and Indonesia. There are 4 areas of interest regarding Australia's approach to the Indonesian mobile esports, and they are market, research, competition, and society. Australia is a strong esports market, and Indonesia, as a part of Southeast Asia, is a growing market. Both have upward trends, and it's important to note that although Australian market is significantly stronger, Indonesian esports have more diverse and balanced source of revenue, such as through broadcasting and advertising compared to Australian esports revenue, which overwhelmingly come from betting. I imagine this is in part due to the grassroots precarious work of mobile esports in Indonesia. Thus, how can we approach the grassroots esports aspect in Australia? Indonesian mobile esports is present in Australia through its popularity among Indonesian diaspora in Australia. Most recently, the Indonesian Consulate General in Melbourne organized Mobile Legends Bang Bang esports competition to celebrate Indonesian Independence Day. Of course, this was just a documented tip of the iceberg. The popularity of mobile esports in Australia might even be stronger should one study it among Indonesian diaspora in other Australian cities such as Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, etc. That is not counting the Chinese, Malay, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Thai, among other communities who may also compete mobile esports in Australia because mobile esports is very popular in their home countries. From research traditions, Indonesian mobile esports might become an interesting entry to research on grassroots esports. From what I've heard from works of Emma Witkowski and Steph Harkin, Australian esports research often comes from a top-down angle, which focus on esports organizations and the authority/policy, whereas Indonesian esports can be framed as having a strong bottom-up elements upon which mobile esports begin among quote-unquote ordinary Indonesians before it is co-opted by the Indonesian government. On the other hand, Australian research on game streaming, which is closely related to esports, do take ethnographic angles, such as a journal article on Australian esports and game streamers by James Manning and Emma Witkowski, and a book on digital game culture by Ingrid Richardson, Larissa Hughes, and Hugh Davis. These approaches will be helpful in studying grassroots esports. Furthermore, the use of smartphone as an esports medium provide an opportunity to study the near seamless integration of esports into wider mobile media uses, digital or otherwise. I firmly believe this opportunity will enrich Australia's already extensive tradition in mobile media research. As far as competition is concerned, popular mobile esports games such as Mobile Legends Bang Bang and PUBG Mobile already have established national and international leagues in and across Southeast Asia. This ecosystem eases Australian esports team and organization should they want to participate in mobile esports. It is also important for Australian schools and university to be able to engage more with its diverse and multicultural students by including mobile esports in scholastic and varsity esports, a la the University of Hawaii at Manoa's approach through Mobile Legends Bang Bang tournaments to engage more with the Filipino students and Asia-Pacific community in general. Ultimately, mobile esports can become an entry point for Australian digital game community to embrace Australia's Asia-Pacific identity. Thank you very much. Any question?
Wonderful, excellent presentations from all three. What we'll do is we'll have all our presenters back up here. If we come, I'll grab you a microphone. Then we'll canvass the room for questions. And I think, are Mark or James online? Yes, okay, great. I'll give you to bounce that one around. All right, I know I've got a lot of questions, but don't let me hog the microphone. Who would like to go first? No one. Okay, it's... Yeah.
Hi, I've got like 10 questions for Haryo. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to limit myself to one. Really, I want to just get drunk with you afterwards and just talk to you.
Yes.
Could you go further into like the geopolitics of all of this? Because I'm seeing both the Indonesian government and Chinese companies sort of collaborating to promote mobile esports. Is there like a deeper political dimension to this that that's like just under the surface of your research? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. That's actually what I'm discussing on the book chapter project that I'm doing. So I think in general, the relationship between the Indonesian government and the Chinese government are quite, mutual. They're quite civil. But there are attempts by the Chinese, I wouldn't say name, but Chinese game publishers who wants to monopolize the mobile esports scenes in Indonesia. So in the sense that if you have a team for our games, then you may not play for games from another publishers. The governments so far, I don't think they pay too much attention on that. They're just wanting things to go just how everything's being planned. But among esports teams in Indonesia, it creates quite an issue. So several esports team has, taking initiative to defy the monopoly system and not wanting to cooperate with the Chinese game publisher who, implement that monopoly system. And in exchange, they would lose credit, they would lose opportunity to monetize the activities more. But I think there has been a lot of defiance toward the monopoly. Antonik. You're welcome.
Great question. Now, any other questions? I'll start one off whilst you all think and build up the courage to ask in public. So this one goes to Mark, who's online. I'll I was just wondering, you mentioned that maybe population size, some of these other kind of cultural factors might have been related to that fear of being identified. Could you comment perhaps on the nature of a collectivist culture? Because there's a big cultural difference there, and is it possible that there is some sense of exposure and feeling different or standing out from the crowd? Could that maybe have factored into that?
Yeah, just to check, you guys can hear me in the room?
Yes, loud and clear.
Excellent, fantastic. Yeah, yeah. I think that's definitely also a part of it. I think Japan hasn't kind of seen a lot of those recent discourses we've seen in the West in the last kind of 10/20 years in terms of all this kind of praise and all this kind of excitement we see about becoming a kind of online celebrity or kind of unusual careers and paths and things like startup culture, and so on, and all these sorts of things which praise and really kind of encourage people towards kind of forge out and do your own thing and stand out and that type of thing. I don't think we've really seen that in the Japanese context, and so I think that's definitely true as well. But on another level, I think it's also just that a lot of the potential for doing something like Twitch as a job, which in general needs you to have your face showing in most cases, is predicated on the size and the volume of the people who are doing Twitch in the English language. And so I think it's also that there do seem to be fewer Japanese game live streamers in general than those broadcasting in English. And so I think it's also that kind of a certain sort of inertia or a kind of required volume of people maybe hasn't been quite reached as much as well. And I think if that changes in the next, say, 5 years, I think we might see more of those kind of entrepreneurial discourses and ideas moving from the English language live streaming context into the Japanese language live streaming context.
Cool. I have a question for Ryan. First of all, congrats on submitting your PhD as well. Very cool. I was wondering if this was this might be a very short no, and that's fine. But I was wondering if, because there's a lot of podcasts now that also are like on YouTube and have video content, and I was wondering if you saw any differences in your research among like that sort of distinction between like audio only podcasts or like podcasts with video, or how people sort of, did people think differently about that sort of thing or anything like that?
Yeah, I did see that. That is an aspect of my research. I didn't see so much in regards to the audience perspective on the authenticity in regards to the video or whatnot. And I think sort of part of why I maybe didn't see the difference is something I didn't really have time to talk to in the presentation, but I want to expand on is there was this idea that I mentioned, I believe it's the Coward and Daniel paper, the 1.5-sided relationships on Twitch, because Twitch's affordances are all built around interacting between the creator and the audience. You have, subs, you have, your super chat messages, stuff like that. Like, it is designed around interaction with audiences. Podcasts aren't designed in that way. And so sometimes they might, especially if they are video. A few of the podcasts that I studied do a sort of live streamed version of it for, paying subscribers, or, maybe they just do it before they upload the podcast version. And so there can be some of that interaction. But I think what is key here is that even when they do it, it's not necessary, right? And that is especially true if they don't do the video version. And I think as a result, what I argue in my thesis and what I think there is sort of here is it's more 1.25 way rather than 1.5. And because it's not baked into the platform, it doesn't feel forced, right? I saw some of the quotes that I got comparing to Twitch were like, oh, they have to be engaging with chat and interacting with chat, If in podcasting they don't have to be, but they do interact, it feels more authentic as a result and feels more valuable for the audience member. And the interesting wrinkle to that is I say, well, they don't have to, but they actually do, because if you go back to sort of my previous presentations and whatnot, their business model is often predicated on audience support. So they do have an incentive to be interacting with the audience in order to keep them engaged and keep them paying the Patreon or whatever. But it's just less clear in the way that sort of it is a fundamental building block of Twitch. And maybe Mark would disagree with me in that regard. I don't know, but yeah.
Nice. Now, I think there was at least one other hand up when I asked before. Question online, wonderful. Okay, so I'll read this one aloud so that everyone can hear it. Okay, so this question is for Mark. All right, I'd like to know about the receptions of viewers watching streamers who don't turn on their camera. Oh. Will it lower authentic feeling in audiences when streamers don't turn on their camera? Interesting.
Well, that's a great question. And this is not trying to give a cagey answer, but I don't think we know at this point. There's a little bit of research on VTubers, but it tends to focus on trying to kind of make sense of who and what VTubers are, because it's a very unusual and quite kind of modern thing. And there's not really much research yet in terms of authenticity when it comes to the VTuber context. With that said, though, there is some research, including that of my honours student Zoe Lee, which explored how a lot of these VTuber spaces can be places for exploring things like gender and race and how you look and how you present and so on. And in those regards, in those sorts of channels, at least, a lot of those viewers do seem to exhibit a lot of the sorts of traits and actions that we would in general expect to see when someone feels a live streamer is very authentic. With that said, though, I think that there's a useful sort of antecedent here, which is that in some of the super early Twitch work I did, which is a decade ago now, according to that kind of awful number I see in the corner of my computer screen, what we found in some of that was that even in early Twitch, there were people who would broadcast as characters. Like, we found one streamer who broadcast as a pirate in essence and dressed up as one and spoke as one and so on. And although those streamers are still extremely rare, we could see even then that it didn't seem to impact how authentic someone felt a streamer was. And in some ways, there seemed to be a sense that the viewers felt that they were kind of watching not a kind of private thing, but that they felt something like you get when you go to the theater, where you know you're watching an act, but it's still a person and you're still engaging with that person on some level, and you're still seeing them kind of care enough to act and to kind of perform in that place. And so right now, I think we don't know, but I think that research on VTubers in general will grow and should shed some more light on this.
Really good answer. It's interesting to see how the self-awareness, both of the caster and the presenter, they're aware of their role in this drama relationship, but also the viewer or listener is aware of the role. So I have a question for Haryo that whilst everyone else thinks of any other questions, if they have, otherwise I've got a long list. So Haryo, it's really interesting to see from an Australian perspective how far we are lagging in terms of esports adoption in secondary schools and how far ahead Indonesia is in that respect, especially with government grants and funding and awards for school students. So I just wanted to I'll pick your brain outside at some point about what we can do because we've got some potential collaborators doing esports in high schools. Now, I was wondering about this dynamic between Australia, Indonesia, and perhaps Oceania in general. We are probably very well known for how bad how much latency we have and how much ping affects our ability to compete in esports when you look at the global the global market and global competition. Has the mobile platform been adopted in Indonesia in relation to that? Is there an advantage to being on mobile, both from a technology perspective and not needing hardwired internet connections, or is competition generally within the same region on those games, and therefore there's no disadvantage?
Okay, thanks very much for the question, Doctor. So regarding whether there's a technological advantage, yes. So mobile is practically much more, requires less stable bandwidth, etc. But I think the primary reason is economic. Like Indonesia earns much less than Australians, and like having to buy computer games and console games can be very expensive. Thus, if we use, because Chinese mobile games, they can be run smoothly in like a $200, $150 smartphones. So I think that's one. The main factor is economy, I would say. And second, do they compete with people from other regions? Yes, they do. So there's two types of competition of esports in Indonesia. The first is offline, like the one you see with all the audience, the caster, etc. And second one is online, the one they like do perhaps in their spare time or in a scheduled time, something like that. And it leads to like a whole new activity such as play gathering, etc. But we can talk about it later. So I think yes, they do compete with each others from other regions, especially online.
Great, thank you so much for the answer. Any other questions? Everyone just really wants the early minute, that's what it is. Okay, why don't I throw out one last one and then we'll see how we go. So for Ryan, first of all, this is a question that might lead on to the next question. Can you tell me a little bit more about the design of how you collected those data? Was it qual, was it quant? Because you mentioned 600 people said this, there was a bit of an overlap. How did you determine these figures?
Yeah, so it was a mixed methods survey. There was 15 questions that were quantitative, and a lot of them were demographic, some being, like, how old are you? What would you say your preferred gender identity is? But also things like, how often do you play games? How often do you listen to podcasts? Do you listen to podcasts while playing games? So some also sort of consumption ones. And then there was the 4 open-ended questions which they could write answers in. And so those questions were, why do you like gaming podcasts? What sets gaming podcasts apart from other forms of gaming media? What do you think of the relationships between fans and creators? And how do you view your relationship with the creator? Essentially, different wording, but those were the cause of the questions. And so I got 2,000 responses. 200 were no response or very incomplete, filtered out. 1,800 responses that filled in the quantitative, and then 1,200 also filled in those qualitative questions. And then I did sort of some coding on them. I essentially did 2 rounds, first to create the code, second to sort of solidify them. And that's sort of where the data that I got and I was talking about came from there. So it was a little bit more than 600 for both of them. But the thing I remember is that there was a difference of 2 coded responses between I feel like this relationship is real and this relationship doesn't exist, right? And there was some overlap. I think there was about 150 responses that were coded as having both at the same time, like the quote that I indicated.
So that leads me on to either question/recommendation. You got some really good data there that you could do some crazy stuff from a mixed methods perspective. You can split your sample into those who said yes and no, for example, and then do word clouds and then see what's the frequency of the dialogue that comes out in this particular cohort and what kind of words they're saying as opposed to what kind of words the other group are saying about authentic versus not authentic, inauthentic. And then explore whether there's some trends in that way. So that's one way you could do your take it. And then you could do some correlational stuff as well if you want, because you've got so many sources of data. But yeah, I got really excited when you said that. I just wanted to know what's the format of your data so we can see what we could do. So the last thing I was going to say for you, and this is just open for comment that you might want to talk generally about. This notion of authenticity due to closeness. You mentioned having someone's voice in your ear, having them in your headphones, and that is intimate. you know. So I wonder, could you talk about the nature of how they view that intimacy and how it might be related to, say, calling a friend on the phone? If you look at the difference between a Twitch streamer, there's a very clear difference where you're sitting there knowing there's people in a chat and you're not it's not private.
Yeah.
So it seems almost like a friendship, you know, that friendship connection, chatting to someone on the phone. Did you see any of that come up with your poll?
Yeah, so I've seen that a bit, and it's also something that has been seen previously a lot in podcast studies. I include one meme in my thesis, and it's one that is like this image that you might have seen, which is like how it feels to listen to podcasts, and it's this kid sitting eating a bowl of ice cream next to an advertisement of like 3 people sitting eating a bowl of ice cream together, and it's like he's a part of it, but he's not. And that's sort of the feeling of podcasts, right? Part of the intimacy is from this very conversational sort of nature, which is different to the sort of conversational nature on Twitch. You know, but sort of at least the common conception, my common conception of Twitch, where it is sort of the one streamer, many audience members talking, and the audience members talking they might have text to speech, but you know, they're not talking in a traditional conversational way as much in that sort of conception, whereas podcasts are very much centered around that. We have this term for it. Most of the podcasts that I studied are what we call chumcasts, which, you know, it's just some mates sitting talking to each other, being chummy. So chumcast. Yeah.
I love it. So time for one more question before we wrap up. Okay, everyone really wants it early. Okay, here we go. Last one. We've got this opportunity. Why not use the opportunity? Let's go for it.
This might be kind of an irrelevant question, but like with a lot of podcasts I listen to, at least, they have their Discord community.
Yeah.
Do you include that in your idea of parasocial? Is that...
Yes, very much so. What I did, a lot of my respondents came from distributing it to these Discord communities. There's a lot I can talk about with the Discord communities. One of the key things is oftentimes Discord communities for these podcasts were used as an incentive for subscribers. You subscribe, you get access to their Discord. But yeah, like in the responses that I was talking about where it was saying it feels like a relationship, some of the things that were cited there were, you know, I chat to them in the Discord. They do know me, you know, sort of thing. So it very much played a part in it.
Wonderful. Well, perhaps we'll bring to a close our discussion on culture and authenticity and intimacy in this wonderful final session of the day here on Ghana Land. Let's give a round of applause for all of our presenters.